Picture this. It's 1961, the Cold War is in full swing, and the United States has just decided the best way to deal with Fidel Castro is to send a bunch of disgruntled exiles back to Cuba armed with surplus rifles, half-baked training, and a prayer. The CIA, never known for humility, pitched this as a quick little island cleanup, like spring cleaning with machine guns. They were convinced Castro would fold faster than a card table at a church rummage sale. Now, this wasn't Kennedy's idea. When he stepped into the Oval Office in January, he inherited a blueprint for chaos from Dwight Eisenhower's administration. Eisenhower had spent years overthrowing foreign leaders like he was flipping through a Rolodex. Guatemala, Iran, you name it. Why not Cuba? After all, Castro had just kicked out American sugar companies, nationalized foreign businesses, and cozied up with the Soviets. For Washington, that was like finding out your ex-girlfriend moved in with your worst enemy. Something had to be done. The CIA's solution was Operation Zapata, which sounds sleek and menacing until you dig into the details. The plan was to take a brigade of Cuban exiles, train them in secret camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua, and then plop them onto Cuban soil to inspire a glorious nationwide uprising. Never mind that the exile recruits were a patchwork of idealists, mercenaries, and the desperate. They were trained to believe that once they landed, the Cuban people would rise up, pitchforks in hand, and overthrow Castro. It was like expecting a mariachi band to form just because you dropped a trumpet in the street. And let's not gloss over the training. The CIA handed out outdated M1 Garand rifles, bazookas that were about as reliable as a 50s television, and machine guns that jam more often than a garage door opener in February. The exiles practiced amphibious landings with boats that leaked like colanders and radio gear that sometimes worked. If you tilted it just right, prayed to St. Jude, and sacrificed a chicken. If Murphy's Law ever needed a dress rehearsal, this was it. But to the CIA, this wasn't incompetence, it was destiny. They actually believed that dropping 1,400 men on a swampy beach in southern Cuba would ignite the same kind of popular uprising that had carried Castro to power. The logic went like this. If a bearded guy in fatigues could topple a corrupt dictatorship, surely another ragtag group could topple the bearded guy. It's the kind of thinking that makes sense only after your third martini at a Georgetown cocktail party. Kennedy, meanwhile, was the new kid on the block, just 43 years old, barely 3 months into his presidency, and already handed the CIA's pet project with a bow on top. He was skeptical, but the CIA brass, men like Allen Dulles, who looked like your grandfather's accountant but thought like a Bond villain, assured him it would be a slam dunk. Kennedy wasn't so much convinced as he was cornered. He didn't want to look soft on communism, not when Cuba was only 90 miles off the Florida coast. So JFK signed off, reluctantly, but with one key caveat: no U.S. fingerprints. The invasion had to look like a Cuban affair, not an American one. This meant no Marines storming Havana, no stars and stripes fluttering over the beach, and most critically, no obvious U.S. air support.
Well, first I want to say that there will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
Plausible deniability was the name of the game, and it would come back to bite them harder than a mosquito in that swampy landing zone. What no one seemed to notice was that secrecy was already a joke. Cuban intelligence knew something was cooking. Castro's spies in Miami and Mexico had practically mailed him the playbook. Even Soviet newspapers were whispering about the invasion months before it happened. By the time Brigade 2506, that was the exiles' unit name, started practicing with their leaky boats, Castro's forces were already planning a welcoming committee with tanks and T-33 jets. It was less a surprise attack and more RSVP to your own ambush. To make matters worse, the CIA's chosen invasion site was the Bay of Pigs, a remote, swampy inlet on Cuba's southern coast. Why there? Because on paper it looked secluded. In reality, it was like invading through a parking lot that doubled as an alligator preserve. The terrain was terrible, the roads were few, and any chance of retreat was about as likely as finding a dry match in a hurricane. But the CIA insisted it was perfect. Isolated enough to avoid Castro's forces, close enough to spark the uprising they were so sure was waiting to happen. So, the stage was set. A rookie president reluctantly giving the nod, a spy agency drunk on its own confidence, and 1,400 Cuban exiles armed with gear that would have made the surplus store clerk wince. All that was left was the execution. And if history has taught us anything, execution is not the CIA's strong suit. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just doomed, it was practically gift wrapped for disaster. From the faulty rifles to the swampy beachhead, every detail was a brick in the comedy of errors that was about to unfold. And when the curtain finally rose in April 1961, it didn't just flop, it face-planted with the grace of a drunk flamingo on roller skates. The Bay of Pigs didn't just spring out of nowhere. It was cultivated like a bad garden. Plenty of fertilizer, too much confidence, and absolutely no pruning of dumb ideas. The seed was planted under President Eisenhower, who by the late 1950s had a nasty habit of rearranging foreign governments like furniture. Iran toppled, Guatemala replaced. Why not Cuba, that sugar-flavored island only 90 miles away? For Washington, Castro's rise in 1959 was the geopolitical equivalent of discovering your neighbor had suddenly built a Soviet missile-shaped mailbox. First, he expropriated U.S.-owned land and businesses. Then he started publicly thumbing his nose at Uncle Sam while courting Moscow like it was prom night. By 1960, the CIA was convinced Cuba had to go, and they wanted to do it without any messy fingerprints. The plan was simple on paper and suicidal in reality. Recruit Cuban exiles who hated Castro, train them in secret, and ship them back to the island to kick off a glorious revolution. The CIA called this kind of thing plausible deniability. Everyone else would later call it delusional. The recruits themselves were a mixed bag. Some were bitter former officers of Batista's toppled regime, still angry they lost their cushy jobs when Castro marched into Havana. Others were idealists who thought they were about to liberate their homeland. Sprinkle in a few opportunists hoping the CIA paycheck might stretch far enough to cover a used Buick in Miami, and you had Brigade 2506, a fighting force as cohesive as a bingo night. Training began in Guatemala, on land so remote it made the middle of nowhere look busy. CIA instructors whipped the exiles into something resembling soldiers, but the gear they handed out looked like leftovers from a military garage sale. Rifles that kicked like mules, mortars that occasionally forgot which direction they were pointed, and bazookas that were about as useful as leaf blowers against Castro's Soviet-supplied tanks. The men trained hard, but every so often a weapon would jam, misfire, or flat out explode, a reminder that made in the USA didn't always mean quality control. The air support plan wasn't much better. The exiles got a handful of B-26 bombers painted to look like defecting Cuban aircraft. It was camouflage in the same way that putting on a Groucho Marx nose is camouflage. Amusing, but not fooling anyone. Even before a single bomb was dropped, Castro had spotted the ruse, called it out publicly, and started preparing for war. The CIA's operational theory relied on one absurd assumption. The Cuban people would rise up against Castro the moment the exiles landed. It didn't matter that Castro's revolution had given many ordinary Cubans land, schools, and medical clinics for the first time. In Langley's eyes, this was going to be a repeat of Hungary 1956 or Czechoslovakia 1948. Only this time, America would be the puppet master. They believed that as soon as bullets flew, peasants would ditch their plows and charge into Havana waving machetes. It was as if the agency thought Cubans were just waiting around like background extras, desperate for someone to yell, "Action!" Meanwhile, Castro wasn't just sitting idle. He'd built a security apparatus with Soviet advisors, filled the island with militia, and staged public rallies that were part pep rally, part intimidation theater. By the time the CIA exiles were doing push-ups in the Guatemalan mud, Castro had already smelled the plot. Cuban intelligence was quietly infiltrating exile groups in Miami, reading their mail, and occasionally bugging their hotel rooms. If the plan was supposed to be a secret, it was about as secret as a fireworks show. Eisenhower's parting gift to Kennedy was this ticking time bomb of a scheme. On its surface, it sounded like bold, covert action. Underneath, it was a logistical nightmare wrapped in wishful thinking. The CIA was so blinded by its own past successes, Iran in '53, Guatemala in '54, that they forgot Cuba wasn't some faraway place with a sleepy population. It was right next door, under Castro's watchful eye, and armed to the teeth. So by early 1961, when Kennedy inherited the project, the disaster was already baked in. The CIA had a group of exiles trained on outdated weapons, a landing plan aimed at one of the swampiest parts of the island, and a wildly optimistic assumption that the entire nation would spontaneously revolt the moment a few boats hit the beach. It was the invasion equivalent of expecting a high school garage band to headline Madison Square Garden just because they bought matching leather jackets. The table was set, the players assembled, and the weapons polished, or at least not too rusty. The only thing missing was someone foolish enough to believe this could work. Unfortunately for Kennedy, he was about to be talked into exactly that. When John F. Kennedy walked into the White House in January 1961, he inherited more than the office. He inherited a CIA midlife crisis wrapped in a PowerPoint that didn't exist yet. They brought him Operation Zapata, a plan so full of holes it could have doubled as Swiss cheese, and told him it was foolproof. Kennedy, though, wasn't so easily impressed. He was young, yes, at 43, the youngest elected president in U.S. history, but he wasn't stupid. The plan smelled off, and he knew it. "Do we really think this will work?" he asked. It was the kind of cautious question that in hindsight sounds like the first line of a tragic comedy. The CIA, led by Allen Dulles, had an answer for everything. The exiles were ready. Castro was unpopular. The Cuban people would rally. It would be quick, clean, and totally deniable. The problem was that Kennedy needed to look tough on communism. This was the height of the Cold War. Moscow was flexing, Washington was nervous, and Cuba had just declared itself open for Soviet business. Kennedy couldn't afford to seem soft. If he killed the plan, Republicans would paint him as a naive rookie. If he went ahead, maybe it would work, and he'd look decisive. And if it failed, well, nobody at Langley seemed to be talking about that. So Kennedy tried to split the difference. He signed off on the operation, but insisted on plausible deniability. No American troops, no overt U.S. military involvement, and absolutely no obvious U.S. fingerprints. The invasion had to look like a homegrown Cuban uprising, not a CIA puppet show. On paper, that sounded clever. In reality, it was like trying to rob a bank while wearing a t-shirt that says, "Definitely not a bank robber." That compromise gutted the plan before it even started. The CIA had counted on U.S. air support to neutralize Castro's air force. Without it, those old B-26 bombers flown by exiles would be left dangling in the sky like ducks in hunting season. The ground invasion relied on quick resupply, but with no official U.S. Navy ships openly involved, the Exile Brigade would be stuck with limited ammo and fuel. Kennedy wanted a cover-op with maximum impact and minimum exposure, which is about as realistic as wanting a fireworks show that nobody hears. It didn't help that secrecy was already shot. Castro's intelligence network had sniffed out the invasion months before. Cuban exiles in Miami were openly talking about their big return. Even Soviet newspapers hinted at an American-backed coup in the works. When Khrushchev is reading about your secret operation over breakfast, you can safely assume it's not all that secret anymore. Still, Kennedy pushed forward. Why? Because the CIA sold him a fantasy. Kennedy wasn't the architect of the Bay of Pigs, but he was the one who had to cut the ribbon. And as history would show, when you greenlight a CIA plan based on wishful thinking, the only thing deniable is common sense. By the spring of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion was less a plan and more a Rube Goldberg machine of bad ideas. The CIA called it Operation Zapata, a name that made it sound bold and revolutionary, when in reality it was about as sturdy as a papier-mâché battleship in a rainstorm. The first big change was location. Originally, the CIA wanted the exiles to land near Trinidad on Cuba's southern coast. That made some sense. It was close to mountains where guerrillas could hide, and it had escape routes. Kennedy, worried it would look too obviously like a U.S. invasion, pushed for something less conspicuous. The result? The Bay of Pigs, a swampy, mosquito-ridden inlet surrounded by sugarcane fields and about as suitable for an amphibious landing as a kiddie pool full of mud. On maps, it looked isolated and perfect. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Few roads, marshland that swallowed trucks whole, and locals who were loyal to Castro. The CIA planners, of course, thought it was genius. It was like picking a battlefield because the lighting looked nice. Never mind that your soldiers were going to drown in the scenery. Secrecy was another running joke. The invasion was supposed to be a covert operation, but Cuban exiles training in Guatemala weren't exactly quiet about it. Rumors spread in Miami like wildfire. Castro spies even managed to infiltrate some exile groups, feeding Havana details about their numbers, weapons, and timetable. By the time the first boats were painted, Castro could have drawn the invasion plan himself, and in some ways he did. Then came the boats. The exiles were supposed to ride into Cuba aboard aging transport ships, many of them retrofitted civilian vessels that handled about as well as drunk elephants on roller skates. Some had faulty landing ramps, others leaked, and at least one had an engine that liked to quit when things got exciting. If your grand plan depends on antique freighters sneaking up on an island guarded by tanks and aircraft, you've already entered farce territory. Air support was equally farcical. The exiles got a handful of World War II era B-26 bombers painted in Cuban Air Force colors, as if slapping a disguise on them would confuse anyone. No, comrade, that bomber dropping American-made bombs and flown by a guy who can't speak Spanish is definitely one of ours. The CIA's hope was that these strikes would knock out Castro's air power before the invasion began. Instead, all it did was tip him off and leave most of his aircraft intact. Meanwhile, Brigade 2506, the exile fighting force, was gearing up with weapons that looked like they'd been scrounged from 3 different wars. Rifles that jammed, bazookas too weak to dent a tank, mortars that were as accurate as a drunk dart player. The CIA seemed to think that courage and patriotism could make up for broken gear. In reality, it just meant the exiles would fight bravely with weapons that betrayed them at every turn. And yet, inside Langley and the White House, optimism reigned. The CIA sold the idea that Castro's regime was hanging by a thread, that a tiny push would send the whole thing crashing down. Kennedy clung to the hope that the invasion would look like an internal Cuban uprising, not a CIA fiasco. The irony, of course, was that the only people who believed in the uprising were the ones planning it in Washington. On the ground in Cuba, Castro was organizing militias, arming civilians, and preparing for exactly what was coming. By mid-April, the invasion force was loaded. The bombers were prepped, and the CIA was patting itself on the back. The wheels of Operation Zapata were officially in motion. Unfortunately, those wheels were square, rusty, and bolted onto a car aimed directly at a brick wall. The curtain was about to rise, and with it, one of the most disastrous performances in the Cold War theater. On April 15, 1961, the grand plan to topple Castro kicked off with an airstrike that was supposed to cripple his air force. 8 B-26 bombers, flown by exile pilots, roared out of Central America toward Cuba. The idea was to bomb Castro's planes while they were still on the ground, erasing his ability to fight back. Simple, right? Well, simple if the bombs actually hit. The raid destroyed a handful of aircraft, but most of Cuba's MiG fighters, T-33 jets, and trusty old Sea Furies survived. The strike was about as decisive as swatting a wasp nest and missing half of the wasps. Castro immediately went on radio, calling the attack exactly what it was, an American operation in Cuban clothing. Washington, meanwhile, insisted it was a spontaneous act by defecting Cuban pilots. Nobody believed it, not even the pilots, who were still wearing their CIA-issued sunglasses. Kennedy, spooked by the international backlash, canceled a second wave of airstrikes that might have actually crippled Castro's air power. Without it, the exiles were about to land on an island guarded by intact aircraft, tanks, and a fully alerted army. It was like canceling pest control after the first spray, then acting shocked when the cockroaches come back angry. 2 days later, in the pre-dawn hours of April 17th, Brigade 2506 began its amphibious landing at the Bay of Pigs. They came in on a ragtag flotilla of freighters with names like Houston and Rio Escondido. These were not sleek military landing craft. They were converted civilian ships that handled invasions about as well as a rowboat handles a hurricane. Almost immediately, things went wrong. Navigation was sloppy, and some units landed miles from their intended beaches. Equipment was unloaded in the wrong places. A few landing ramps jammed, forcing men to jump over the sides with rifles held above their heads, like your kids trying not to get their sneakers wet. Only this wasn't a puddle. It was swampy, waist-deep water filled with mud, mosquitoes, and the occasional alligator. The exiles fought their way ashore, but the surprise was gone. Castro's forces were already mobilizing. Within hours, Cuban T-34 tanks rumbled towards the beaches, supported by artillery and swarms of militia. The exiles had bazookas, sure, but most were the weak 2.36-inch models left over from World War II, the kind that bounced off tank armor like spitballs. Against Castro's Soviet-built armor, they were about as effective as throwing beer cans. In the air, things went from bad to worse. Exile-flown B-26 bombers tried to provide cover, but were chewed up by Castro's surviving jets and anti-aircraft fire. One bomber, riddled with bullets, limped back towards Nicaragua before crashing into the sea. The pilots were brave men, but bravery doesn't do much against an intact air force. Every hour that passed, Castro's grip on the skies tightened. On the ground, the radios crackled uselessly. Communications equipment malfunctioned or was waterlogged from the landings. Units that were supposed to coordinate were instead isolated pockets of confusion, trading fire with Cuban militia while wondering where their support was. Supplies were just as bad. Crates of ammo got dumped in the wrong boats or lost in the surf, while fuel shortages crippled vehicles before they even reached the fight. And then came the Houston. One of the supply ships packed with ammunition and vital gear was bombed and sunk by Cuban aircraft. The Rio Escondido, carrying fuel, was also destroyed. In one afternoon, the exiles lost the bulk of their resupply capability. Imagine showing up to a football game with half of your team missing, and then finding out the equipment truck blew up in the parking lot. That was Brigade 2506 by the end of day one. Kennedy, watching from Washington, wavered. His commanders begged for U.S. airstrikes to save the invasion. The CIA argued that a token show of force would make the difference. Kennedy, terrified of blowing the plausible deniability fig leaf, said no. American fighters sat on aircraft carriers nearby, twiddling their wings, while exile troops bled on the sand. By nightfall, the beaches of the Bay of Pigs looked like a war movie directed by slapstick comedians. Exiles were pinned down by Cuban artillery, strafed by Castro's aircraft, and cut off from reinforcements. Their weapons jammed, their radios sputtered, and their supplies were at the bottom of the bay. They had courage in spades, but courage without logistics is just a tragic headline. Castro, meanwhile, strutted through Havana like a man who had just been handed the world's easiest script. He knew the Americans were behind it, he knew the exiles were doomed, and he wasted no time rallying the Cuban people with fiery speeches about Yankee imperialists. Far from sparking an uprising against Castro, the invasion sparked a rally for him. People who might have quietly grumbled about the revolution now saw themselves as defending Cuba against foreign invaders. The CIA had promised a domino effect, and delivered it, only in the opposite direction. By the end of the first 24 hours, Murphy's Law had officially taken command. If it could go wrong, it had. If it could break, it did. And if there was one thing worse than an overconfident CIA plan, it was an overconfident CIA plan left half finished by a cautious president. The invasion was supposed to last 3 days. At this pace, it was going to collapse in less than that. The first day at the Bay of Pigs was bad. The second was worse. What began as a messy landing had turned into a slow-motion disaster, with Brigade 2506 stranded on hostile sand, outgunned, outnumbered, and cut off from resupply. If war is supposed to be chess, this was checkers played on a board that was already on fire. The exiles fought bravely. Nobody can say otherwise, but bravery is a terrible substitute for logistics. They had rifles that jammed, mortars that walked shells in every direction but the right one, and bazookas that made about as much impression on Castro's T-34 tanks as tossing a shoe. Cuban troops, meanwhile, rolled forward with Soviet hardware, backed by artillery and supported by militia who knew the terrain like the backs of their calloused hands. Then came the sky. Castro's surviving aircraft, the T-33 jets, Sea Furies, and the few MiG-15s dominated overhead. The exiles' B-26 bombers tried to help but were swatted down like flies. Several went down in flames, and those that survived limped back to Central America, holes in their fuselages big enough to climb through. With the supply ships sunk and air cover gone, the beach became a killing ground. The radios, when they worked, carried desperate calls for help, more ammo, more air support, anything. But Washington wasn't listening. Kennedy had pulled the plug on direct U.S. involvement. There would be no Navy jets swooping in, no Marines storming the beach, no cavalry. The men of Brigade 2506 were alone. It was like being abandoned in the middle of a bar fight by the friend who swore he had your back, only this time the bar was full of tanks. Food and water ran short almost immediately. Ammunition dwindled to the point where men counted their rounds before firing. Some units rationed themselves to single shots, waiting until Cuban troops were almost on top of them before squeezing the trigger. The landing zone was littered with broken gear, rusted rifles tossed aside, radio batteries drained, mortars silent. The very tools the CIA promised would sustain them had turned into scrap. At Playa Giron and Playa Larga, small pockets of Brigade 2506 held out against overwhelming odds. They dug into the sand, turned wrecked trucks into makeshift barricades, and fired until their barrels glowed. They knocked out a few tanks, shot down a plane or two, and gave as good as they could. But it was like trying to hold back a tide with a bucket. Castro, for his part, was everywhere, driving between battlefronts in his trademark olive fatigues, waving a pistol, delivering speeches from the hood of a tank. He wasn't just leading, he was performing. For Cubans on the fence, seeing their leader strut confidently under fire sealed the deal. This wasn't a dictator hiding in a bunker. This was a man fighting for Cuba against invaders. The CIA's dream of a popular uprising against Castro collapsed into dust. Instead, the invasion had turned Castro into a folk hero with live ammunition. Meanwhile, Kennedy's inner circle was falling apart. Military chiefs begged for airstrikes. CIA officials argued for reinforcements. Kennedy sat in the middle, paralyzed. He had demanded deniability, and now the price was being paid in blood. Every decision he made to keep American hands invisible only made the fingerprints more obvious. The whole world could see who was behind this clown show. By the second night, the exiles were running on fumes. They fought hand to hand in some places, trying to push back Cuban troops with bayonets and fists. Civilians loyal to Castro poured in as militia, armed with shotguns, pistols, or whatever they could scrounge. For every exile who stood his ground, 10 Cubans closed in. When dawn broke on the third day, it was over in all but name. The brigade's pockets of resistance were collapsing, their ammunition spent, their supplies gone. Some men tried to swim out to sea, only to be gunned down by strafing aircraft or dragged back to shore. Others huddled in mangroves, looking like hunted animals, hoping for rescue that would never come. The Bay of Pigs was no longer an invasion. It was a slaughterhouse. and every hour it dragged on, the United States' humiliation deepened. 3 days earlier, the CIA had promised Kennedy a quick, deniable victory. What he got instead was a broadcast failure, live to the world. The exiles had fought with guts, but guts without support is just fertilizer for someone else's propaganda. The fight for the beach was finished. All that remained was the collapse, and the bill that would come due in Washington. By the third day, the Bay of Pigs wasn't a battle. It was a demolition derby where only one side had cars that worked. Brigade 2506 was spent, bloodied, starving, nearly out of ammo, and surrounded by an enemy that only seemed to grow in numbers. The plan that was supposed to topple Castro in 3 days had instead managed to destroy itself in exactly that amount of time. On the beaches, the last cartridges were being counted like coins in a beggar's cup. Some fighters had only a handful of rounds left, which they saved for the next Cuban tank that rolled within spitting distance. Others had nothing but bayonets and sidearms, which might have been useful in 1812, but not against a column of Soviet-supplied armor in 1961. Radio spat static or silence. The few messages that got through were pleas for air support or resupply, both of which had already been denied. The men of Brigade 2506 knew it. They'd been promised U.S. backing, that if things got hot, help would come. Instead, they were abandoned on a strip of swamp and sand, fighting with broken rifles and empty stomachs. It was like being told the fire department was on the way, only to discover the fire chief canceled the call because he didn't want his truck seen in the neighborhood. Castro's forces tightened the noose. His T-34 tanks prowled the beaches like steel sharks, their 85mm guns flattening anything that moved. Cuban infantry and militia pressed from every side, confident and emboldened. From the air, T-33 jets strafed anything that resembled a defensive position. The exiles returned fire with what little they had left, but it was like throwing gravel at a freight train. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Kennedy's advisors were in full panic mode. CIA officials begged for another round of bombing, insisting the invasion could still be salvaged. The Joint Chiefs of Staff all but demanded that Marines be sent ashore. Kennedy, however, dug in. To preserve plausible deniability, he refused to escalate. In practice, that meant the exiles were left to die with the president watching from the Situation Room. History may have called it cautious, but to the men on the beach, it looked a lot like betrayal. By the evening of April 19th, it was over. Out of ammunition, surrounded on all sides, and with no hope of rescue, Brigade 2506 laid down their arms. Roughly 200 had been killed. The rest, more than 1,000, were captured and paraded as prisoners. Castro, cigar in hand, walked among them like a conquering general in a victory parade. He had turned America's covert operation into a live-action humiliation broadcast to the entire world. For the exiles, it was devastation. They had been promised liberation, armed with broken tools, and sent into a trap. Instead of freeing Cuba, they ended up filling Castro's prisons. For the CIA, it was a black eye so swollen it still hadn't healed. And for Kennedy, it was his first great disaster as president, one that would haunt him in every confrontation with the Soviets to come. When the smoke cleared, the Bay of Pigs was less an invasion and more of a case study in how to trip over your own shoelaces on the world stage. In just 72 hours, the United States had taken a small covert operation, botched it, and managed to hand Fidel Castro the single greatest propaganda victory of his career. The prisoners were valuable, and Castro knew it. He wasn't about to execute them en masse, not when they could be bartered. Instead, they were held in Cuban prisons until 1962, when the United States agreed to exchange them for $53 million worth of food and medicine. That deal made for another bitter irony. The CIA's freedom fighters were ultimately traded back for baby food, powdered milk, and pharmaceutical supplies. It was less a ransom than a supermarket sweep. For Kennedy, the political fallout was brutal. He had campaigned as young, bold, and decisive. Now he looked naive and reckless. Critics in Washington tore him apart. Republicans called him weak. Hawks in his own party accused him of betraying the exiles. The CIA, for its part, tried to spread the blame around, but Kennedy wasn't fooled. He knew they'd oversold a fantasy and left him holding the bag. Within months, CIA Director Allen Dulles was out of a job, sacrificed to show the president was cleaning house. But firing a few spy masters couldn't undo the damage. America's credibility had taken a nosedive. To allies, the Bay of Pigs made Washington look incompetent. To enemies, it showed Kennedy could be tested. And in Havana, it locked Castro firmly into Moscow's embrace. If the United States had hoped to scare Cuba away from the Soviets, it had done the opposite, driven them into a bear hug. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failure, it was a failure with interest. And the bill would come due in October 1962 when the world discovered Soviet missiles parked in Cuban fields, weapons pointed at American cities, placed there in part because Castro had learned the hard way that the Yankees were incompetent but dangerous, and Khrushchev wanted to keep it that way. In the end, the Bay of Pigs stands as a permanent cautionary tale, proof that hubris, bad planning, and denial can sink even the mightiest power. A fiasco in a swamp, remembered not for its heroism but for its stupidity. The CIA called it Operation Zapata. History calls it what it was, the Bay of Idiots. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.